Stay tuned after this episode for a bonus interview from Ken's adventures at the SAA with Dr. Gabe from the Canadian Museum of History.
You'll see us because we'll have Gabe will be walking around with one of those big like sort of a goofy, like a very large chain and the microphone hanging off of it, so we can just kind of grab you in the hallway and go.
Yeah, usually I'm the Indiana Jones of Canadian archaeology, but at the CAAs I'm the Flavor Flav of Canadian archaeology.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reineck and Ken Holyoke.
Well, welcome back to the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reineck here in Southern New England, and I'm joined, as I am every fortnight, by Ken Holyoke in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
Not too bad. It's actually, there's still light outside right now as we record this podcast, which is a sign of the times.
Well, that's fascinating. Here in Manchester, New Hampshire, it's dark, but it is really, really warm. But to quote, have you ever seen the movie Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee film?
I don't think I have.
Right. But so to paraphrase Sweet Dick Willie from Do the Right Thing, it ain't never too hot nor too cold for the New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. So
there
here we are.
Oh, what an opening.
And what an opening. Yeah, I know. The entirely unscripted listener, don't worry. And this week we're going to be talking about the transitional or the terminal archaic from about 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. We are sponsored, as we are every fortnight, by the Association of Professional Archaeologists of New Brunswick. We have on good authority this week that we have still not paid our web hosting service, and there is still no website, but stay tuned. We'll let you know as soon as it's back.
That coveted apanb.ca URL, though, is still in our possession, I believe.
It is. And in fact, if you're going to be at the Canadian Archaeology Association meeting here in a month or so, catch Ken and I at the bar. And we've got a great story for you about that URL that it tickles us, and we assume it'll tickle you too. So we wanted to open with a little note about our music, which you have just heard, which is that our music, some of our music is by Justin Hankey, and he now has a podcast of his own, and it's about the band Weezer. And Ken, do you know the band Weezer?
I do. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So you'll know that they've done such hits as The Sweater Song, Island of the Sun, Beverly Hills, Hash Pipe.
Yep. I'm familiar. Yeah. I don't know. Isn't the Island in the Sun with the one with all the fluffy animals? The music video?
I think that was the music video. Yeah. So I mean, we probably had a different experience because you were watching this on what's that AM Canadian one? It was a Much Music. That was called
Much Music. Yeah.
Yeah. They I've never seen Much Music because I didn't live in Canada at that moldable stage in my life. But yeah,
it was peak Canadiana. It was you should look up the old Speaker's Corner videos actually. That
really?
Where they used to have this, it was basically like an ATM downtown outside the Much Music studio, and you put $1 in and you could just record yourself. And so like, it's like right down in the bar district in downtown Toronto. And so they just had a bunch of, revelers out there that would just show up and rant about something. And it would record your rant, and then they would just play it at random times during the day in between like the music videos and things like that.
Well, Ken, I think you've just given us the idea for how we're going to do the early Woodland podcast in the next fortnight.
It's true. And it's actually how the Bare Naked Ladies got their start, is my understanding.
Is it really?
They showed up as a band on Speaker's Corner and got discovered. I think that's true.
Well, it is now, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So that may be our Hakuna Errata for next week, for next fortnight.
It might be, or it's possible that we'll check Wikipedia next week and we'll find ourselves cited as having entered into the Bare Naked Ladies lore about all of this. But anyway, Justin, who is quite a Weezer enthusiast, I believe he was president actually of the Weezer fan club for some number of years.
Oh wow!
He's his podcast is called Weezer, and then in parentheses, and one more thing. And so each week he talks about something to do with the band Weezer. and then something else that's been sitting in his mind. So the most recent one, he talks about Weezer, and then he talks about shopping malls from the 80s. And so we would encourage you to check it out. And it's available much like our podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. It's RSS and then RSS. I think it's that, or is it? I can't remember how many S's in the RSS, but
two. RSS.com.
It autofills when I check our metrics. So check that out. But speaking of our metrics, we wanted to thank you all because this last fortnight we've comfortably cracked 1,000 listeners.
Yes, 1,000 downloads. So I think there's actually an applause required there. I may actually add some special effects in here, maybe a little cheering sound.
Absolutely. Maybe
if I can find a free one. But really thrilling. It really is to, all jokes aside, when we started doing this, we were going to be thrilled if we hit 100 downloads, and going over 1,000 is really something quite exciting. So thank you, listener, for being a part of this.
We do, and Ken and I were actually joking. We really appreciate this in part because whenever we write something, we're always thrilled if 3 people read it and 1 person cites it. So the fact that right, if any, So I'm definitely over on a few things, but so we're thrilled, and we do really appreciate that you've made us part of your commute or whatever else. You don't need to tell us necessarily. You don't need to write in and let us know what part of your life we've become a part of, but we appreciate it nonetheless. And
we do have some listener mail on that too, actually.
Oh, fantastic. Go for it.
Yeah. So we have the usual email from our...
Sorry, Ken, if a listener were to write in with some listener mail, where would they write into?
New Brunswick Archaeology at gmail.com.
Okay.
And we do have the listener mail. We've got 2 new, we've got their usual spam from Podcorn, which is another one of these great... I think they're trying to get us to sell stuff on the podcast, as far as I can tell. But
how much? What do they want us to sell? We could perhaps talk to them. I don't know.
I haven't clicked on many of these ones, so
dear listener, if you're a representative for the Balvenie Scotch Company and you'd like us to move some merch, we're happy to say nice things for your.
Yeah, we don't. It doesn't have to be a half-empty bottle of Courvoisier every week. It could be. No. So David Black enjoyed the intrusive feature 1B episode, and he's asking us if we're going to be podcasting from the Canadian Archaeological Association meetings in Membertou the first week of May. So
Dave, we are indeed, and in fact, dear listener, we might try to get Dave Black on this because this will be a hit piece. But we're doing papers in honor of Dave Black at the CAAs this year.
Yeah, and so join us in Membertou or online as well. Somehow, there's going to be a virtual component of that session. Is that correct?
Yes, there is, but I'm not actually sure if it's a virtual that you can watch it virtually.
Oh, okay, all right. So don't take my word on that, listener. You may not be able to attend virtually, so just come to Membertou and have fun.
And in fact, the listener should know that Ken and I have been somewhat bewildered by the CAAs. When was the one we did in Quebec? Was it 2019?
That must have been 2019.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that was when I first really realized that. I didn't realize how the CAAs worked. And it's been an adventure ever since.
My understanding is that it is not an easy process. That's
no, I'm sure it's not.
Yeah. So
yeah.
We also have email from Ruby History Hound, who said she enjoys, I assume she enjoys the show and all the information that we give to the listeners. Always looks forward to seeing new episodes pop up on her feed, and has suggested that the title of the show should be Chasing New Brunswick. Okay,
well, we will take that under advisement, Ruby History Hound. Ruby, I believe, has an Instagram actually that follows our Instagram.
And okay.
Ruby may actually be, I'm trying to remember exactly, but a large dog who each year maybe each week, I'm not sure, features a series of 2 or 3 history-oriented podcasts and summarizes them.
No way.
Yeah, and actually very generously gave us one on an earlier one where she kind of gave the bullet point version of what we talked about. It was very nice.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, so I would encourage them, the listener, to check out Ruby's Instagram.
Okay. If I were on Instagram, I would also check her out.
Yeah. That's where the hound comes in, I believe.
Yeah. So I'll need you to screenshot that and send it to me.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, as the listener has probably gotten the sense that just from my tone of voice that I'm on Instagram because I've carefully curated my Instagram. They can tell this from my slightly allergic nasal thing going on right now, which is that I'm a bit of a cat enthusiast. So my Instagram pretty much produces exclusively videos of cats in bodegas. So it's the best thing going on social media as far as I'm concerned.
There's a great bookstore downtown here in Lethbridge called the Analog Bookshop,
Oh, cool.
and they have a resident cat that hangs out,
great.
has its like little perch above the doorway, and will just like kind of hang around and follow you around as you're looking at books.
That's fantastic. So the just since we're talking about cats, I was in Death Valley, as you know, which straddles Nevada and Las Vegas, and so but at one point we stayed in Amargosa Valley, and the only place to eat in Amargosa Valley really is this kind of casino, which is called Longstreet's, and it's they basically, like, the place we were staying, the Amargosa Opera House. They're like, well, if you drive 9 miles, that's 1,000 kilometers for the Canadian listener, you'll get to Longstreet's, and then maybe 80 miles later you'll get to somewhere else. I don't know where. And so we went to Longstreet's, and the food, I have to say, and the listener should know that Longstreet's is not paying for this spot, but the food was very good. But you had to get a drink from the like video gaming table or whatever at the this bar, and there's this cat walking around, and so I go up to get a drink for me and my companion, and I said, "What's the cat's name?" And the woman looked at me as if no one had ever asked what the cat's name was, and she just looked at me. She said, "Jackpot." That's funny. And then Jackpot promptly went and just kind of lounged across someone's video gaming terminal. So I thought Jackpot knows what's up.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, no, it was fun. Do you have any other listener mail this weekend?
No other listener mail this week. No.
Okay, well, fantastic. So, Ken, I believe that we still, even though we're taking the advice of History Hound Ruby History Hound under advisement, we, at least at the moment, still have an open competition to rename this podcast. And we should hear perhaps what a lucky listener would win were they to send in the name that this podcast eventually adopts. And what is that, Ken?
Well, so it's getting nice out. You said it's quite warm in New Hampshire. And what's something that makes you think of summer?
Peaches.
And so we're going to be talking a little bit about Georgia today in the context of the Transitional Archaic. And did you know what today is?
I did not. What is it?
It is International Peach Cobbler Day.
No kidding.
And so this week's prize, if you were the listener to suggest the name of the new podcast, would be an all expenses paid round trip with Gabe and I to the Georgia Peach Festival, 37th annual Georgia Peach Festival in Fort Valley, June 2nd and 3rd, or in Byron, Georgia, on June 10th, which is actually my birthday. So we would get to celebrate my birthday together.
And the listener doesn't necessarily know that Ken and Lord Byron, both literary gentlemen, have the same birthday.
And so at this Georgia Peach Festival, even though International Peach Cobbler Day is today, April 13th, at the Georgia Peach Festival, you can get the world's largest peach cobbler, which is made every year to exacting standards. It measures 11 by 5 feet, which in metric is 3.35 by 1.52 meters. And alongside this other thing, there are 2 different types of peaches that you can get down there. There's clingstone and freestone. And that August is peach month. So they really spread out celebration of peaches throughout the year with a peach cobbler day to kind of get you ready for the year. Maybe you're just taking all the frozen peaches from last year and throwing them in a cobbler. But if you listener are the one to suggest our next to suggest our new podcast title, you could be joining us in Georgia, enjoying peaches at the 37th annual Georgia Peach Festival.
I have to say, listener, I really hope we're seeing you there. This sounds fantastic. Are you have you been to Georgia before, Ken?
I haven't. I've heard you rave reviews of the Savannah River, though.
Well, of Savannah, yeah.
Of Savannah.
Very partial Savannah, yeah. But no, I bet they do a great peach cover. What town in Georgia is this in? Do you know?
Fort Valley.
At
Fort Byron. It's such a big festival. They actually spread it out over 2 weekends in 2 different towns.
No kidding. That's great.
Yeah.
The listener who may have acquired recently a New Brunswick Archaeology podcast sticker will be relieved to know that the counties in Georgia are more sensibly arranged. They're not that sort of spokes on a wheel thing that we seem to do in New Brunswick. That we should do a whole thing. I mean, I don't know if we can get someone that's like a county expert, but to describe those counties in New Brunswick.
I do wonder what actually like resulted in that layout.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems like they were sort of like, well, I like bicycles. Let's make the whole thing look like spokes off a bicycle.
Yeah.
That's not what we're talking about this week. We're going to talk about the Transitional Archaic. And so we're going to talk about 4,000 to 3,000 years ago. And so Ken and I should say at the get-go that we debated a little bit whether or not we should combine the Transitional Archaic and the early woodland, which we're going to talk about in 14 days. And we decided not, and that's because the early woodland session is likely to take, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours probably. You're going to want to listen to it on 2.5 speed, or maybe save it for a long car trip. So we've decided to carve this off. And I certainly can have to say I don't have any clue what's going on during this period. I find it baffling.
It is yeah, there's some so we kind of dusted a little bit of a preview when we left off with the late Archaic, and as kind of abruptly saying, and then it ends. and in its wake something different is happening, and what it is, it's not really clear, but it's got kind of connections all the way up. I mean, as we saw in the early Archaic, kind of connections all the way up the eastern seaboard, at least as it relates to coming into the Maritimes, and certainly some broader connections with groups in the Great Lakes region, but certainly other than technology, there's not a whole lot of real clear, and even technologically it's not totally cohesive.
Yeah. Maybe it's too cohesive. Maybe that's the problem. It's too many points, too many names, or too few points, too many names. I'm not really sure what the phrase would be, but
yeah, typological conundrums. That's
yeah. So the period we're talking about, something that's called we've been calling the Transitional Archaic. Something's called the Terminal Archaic. In southern New England, sometimes they call it the Final Archaic, which you can have. It's very ominous, the Final Archaic. Yeah. Easy there, Ken. We might have just gotten sued by or kicked off the air. So when we think about the Transitional Archaic, we're thinking about it's really this kind of phenomenon that between Georgia, very appropriate given the potential winnings this week, to the Maritimes, that about 4,000 years ago, there's this kind of unique toolkit. And so I realize, listener, every time I've said we introduce any period, I say, well, and there's a unique toolkit. And this is not that unique. Don't worry. There's a toolkit that's different than the one before it. And what it is it involves these broad spears. And so, Ken, you're the lithics guy. What's a broad spear look like?
Broad spear, I mean, simply kind of looks almost like how you would draw a Christmas tree. It's sort of a broad triangle. I guess it's not you don't have as many sort of, like, the listener can't see I'm drawing with my fingers right now. Yeah. But you don't have the little branches that might come off of a Christmas tree, but it's sort of like a broad triangle. In some cases, they're sort of squat and wide, tend to have broad shoulders, which means like the triangle down at the base comes in and then sort of tapers into either with broad, what we call notching, which is sort of you've removed the corners off of what I guess would be a diamond shape to make kind of a U shape on either side. And then sometimes they have these straight, very wide bases, which would have been what we call the haft element. So that would have been the part that's sort of attached to, a dart point or a spear or whatever. And we call them broad spears simply because they are broad and they look like they were probably spears. They were probably a projectile of some kind, and likely were not thrown as a spear, but more likely kind of like an atlatl dart or something like that. But yeah. So, and they're usually made on volcanic rocks, so very sort of hard, kind of dull colored rocks, generally felsic and mafic volcanics, as we call them. So felsic meaning sort of lighter colored, mafic darker colored volcanic rocks. And they've got a number of different forms, but some of the most recognizable ones we'll talk about today are sort of in the early transitional archaic. You've got our Atlantic blades or Atlantic implement blades sometimes. I think there's the same as they're sometimes called Mansion Inn as well.
Oh, I worried you'd say that, Ken. But yeah, there are Mansion Inn blade. There's from the Mansion Inn site in southern New England, which Dana Dinkhouse worked at. But those are thrown in here, yeah, for sure.
And you also have in like the Great Lakes region, you have what are called Genesee blades that are sort of another take on a broad spear. And as we talked about, sort of originating in Georgia, you have what's called like the Savannah River or what is it called, Lehigh or Kena Crispin style points. And basically these are all kind of different names for what is sort of a broadly applicable broad point template, basically.
Absolutely. So, and this, just like the listeners have heard about other periods, right? So we archaeologists have to think about all this stuff just in terms of what's left behind, right? So we're sort of sorting through this, but we've got these basically stone tools, but along with this, for this transitional archaic, we see stuff that includes steatite, which is soapstone. So it's a soft stone, which it's possible, I think, like Ken Sassman has argued that the kind of, you can make these sort of dishes out of steatite, which may be sort of predecessors to ceramics in the region, which we'll talk about more in the coming weeks. There are groundstone adzes. There are grooved axes, which are sometimes the adzes and the axes sometimes appear in caches. And there are banner stones, and those are weights for atlatls. And an atlatl is a spear chucker. And there are drills. And Ken, I understand that I recall. So Ken and I went to our master's program together, and Ken had also had his undergraduate where we did our master's, and so had on display, I believe, in the department we were in at UNB, a Susquehanna drill that he'd written up.
Yeah. So as part of a senior undergrad honors class, I think, project, the honors class, basically, so the George Frederick Clark artifact collection, which was donated to UNB by George Frederick Clark's family. So UNB has it as a teaching collection now.
And we should say we'll probably do a whole episode on Clark at some point, but he's an important navigational archaeologist in New Brunswick.
And a dentist.
And a hypnotist.
And a hypnotist, really.
Did you not know that? No. My understanding is he basically paid his way through dental school as a hypnotist.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, there you go. Groundstone.
The listener can't see that Ken just had his eyes totally turned into having a pocket watch swinging in front of him. I just do this once in a while just to see what'll happen. You know, it's the people that know Ken in person will know that sometimes it's hard to get a word in edgewise, but that's how I've been managing it on this podcast. Is I just every once in a while I whip out my pocket watch and I slow him down a little bit so I can have something to say.
We were basically given each an artifact to analyze and describe. The one that I got was what is a sort of flared bit flakestone drill. It's about, if I remember correctly, about 7 or 8 centimeters long. It's broken, and the type of break that's on it indicates what's characteristic of a lot of these drills, and that is probably some kind of push-pull wear. So these weren't being used spun like a drill. They were probably being used as some kind of like pecking or sort of light drilling tool. But there's a lot of like an awl. Yeah, kind of like an awl. And they would have had really long stems on them. And what's not clear is whether or not these are sort of intentionally made drills, or these are just basically points that had been sharpened down to the point that they, like I think these are sort of these are diagnostic of Susquehanna. These drills appear a lot, but it's not clear if the drill is something that was intentionally made, or if it was one of these repurposed tools that then was turned into a drill, which we see broken and abandoned at a lot of these sites. So you see finished drills as well, but these aren't necessarily the intended tool to make. They may be just a repurposed tool and go from there.
Cool. And we'll return to this drill thing when we talk about potential implications about this period along with watercraft technology in a few minutes. But and then also in southern New England, I don't think there are any of these known from the Maritimes, but cremation burials are a common transitional archaic thing in New England. So a lot of the way we think about this period, and so you'll hear this phrase, sometimes people even instead of transitional archaic, they'll say Susquehanna, right? And so Susquehanna refers to this kind of big overarching cultural thing which derives from the mid-Atlantic. And actually, I don't know if we Ken and I don't always talk about the where we want to go necessarily with this podcast, but the kind of classical understanding of Susquehanna was that it was this kind of intrusive cultural thing, so that maybe 4,000 years ago, 1,300 years ago, a bunch of people from the Mid-Atlantic moved rapidly from the Mid-Atlantic, basically north and east, and sort of inhabited this broader region. I'm fairly skeptical of that as a concept, like as a population replacement concept, although I think it's clear that something big and cultural happened around this period. But reflecting that in a sort of cultural historical terms, the Susquehanna, that broad, perceived as migratory thing, is broken into these phases. And these phases are based on, well, I guess we should say what a phase is. And so what a phase is, yeah. So the listener can't see that Ken is smirking now because he's watching me back myself into a cultural historical corner here, where it's like, oh, we should say what a phase is. And then pretty soon I'll have to describe a horizon. And then I'll have to describe, a tradition, all these other.
Well, we talk about whole cultures as well, so we're gonna have to.
Yeah. No, what was that old David Sanger line, "Taming the Taxonomy," or was that somebody else?
I don't know.
Yeah. So anyway, but what a phase is it's kind of this like, subset of a broader cultural thing. So it's this idea that it's spatially and temporally limited.
Usually ends up being like there's everything changes, like the projectile points change, but everything else sort of stays the same. So they bury their people the same way, they live in the same kind of places and stuff like that. But something has changed within, like maybe the toolkit, for example, which is sort of what characterizes the phases of Susquehanna.
Yeah, the listener who may have just traded in a 2012 Subaru for a 2022 Subaru may wonder about their own cultural affinities based on this sort of system that archaeologists devise. Everything's the same. It's not a station wagon anymore. It's a crossover SUV.
Yeah. As long as you get the head gasket changed at 100,000 kilometers, that's the
yeah, exactly.
And it stays the same.
Yeah, and the engine wrecker belt there. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah, timing belt. The timing belt.
Yeah. But anyway, so for reasons we'll maybe unpack in a minute here, but the first phase of this from like 4,000 to 3,600 years ago is often called Watertown, and then from about 3,200 to 2,700 is usually called Atlantic is about 4,000 to 3,600, Watertown 3,600 to 3,200. Then sometimes in between here, there's a phase that no one has ever been able to figure out what it is, but it's sometimes called Coburn. As far as I can tell, Coburn is kind of a fever dream. And I've never really heard even people that believe in Coburn, they don't always believe in Coburn like later in their careers. And then later, there's Orient, which is 3,200 to, 2,700 or, whatever. It's still the early woodland, basically, which we'll talk about in a fortnight.
Yeah.
But these don't matter if you just really care about New Brunswick archaeology, because none of these are really particularly clear in New Brunswick. Maybe in Nova Scotia at the Boswell site where Mike Deal and John Campbell and these guys worked, it seems like there's some, consistency to these things, but otherwise not so much. Does that kind of jive with your understanding, Ken?
Yeah. I mean, like, I think that there are a lot of the phases. You don't see sort of the breakdown of them. You see some of these type index fossil artifacts, right? So what we call these diagnostic artifacts, these one that you can probably associate with these. So each of these phases, Atlantic, Watertown, and Orient, tend to have fairly distinctive takes on the broad spear form. or what later becomes small, narrow stem points, as they call them in Great Lakes. But by the Orient phase, you have these are not so broad spears anymore, and they've changed the way that the haft element looks on them. But you see a lot of Orient
went from baby
phase
got
stuff.
back to baby had back, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So you see
It's
a lot
laughing
of
like a man who may nervously have to cut this out to maintain our family rating, but
it's just more editing I have to do later on. So you see a lot of these Orient phase artifacts, but not a whole lot of like dated Orient phase assemblages, which we'll talk about in a moment. Although there is at least one convincingly Orient phase assemblage in the lower Wolastoq region at Jemseg, which we'll talk about later. But yeah, the whole Susquehanna suite doesn't seem to appear in New Brunswick, which is different than elsewhere, which has led some people to speculate about, if this was a group of people coming into the region, they look to have maybe stopped somewhere around the lower Wolastoq region and went no further.
Which would be really interesting. I mean, and so we're going to keep having these things where Ken and I say it would be very interesting, because this is a confusing few thousand years that we are launching into. And so, but it's less confusing at some places in Maine, which I think is interesting. If we just sort of think in broad terms, right, we've talked in the past about the Maritime Peninsula, this sort of eastern Wabanaki homeland, right, Maine, most of Maine, Maritime provinces. Within this region, if you were just to kind of average this region, most of what we know about the Transitional Archaic is from the Turner Farm site. And so this is in Penobscot Bay in Maine. And so I don't think it's speaking out of school to say that David Sanger wants to describe the Turner Farm site as a telephone booth shaped look at what Maine prehistory should be.
Yeah.
This idea that it's this unique site that has more time in it than any other site in Maine. And so,
and what the listener doesn't realize, may not realize, is that we spend a lot of time in the far Northeast in the Maritimes talking about how we want to challenge like outside models, that we build our culture. We've been building our culture history off of these broader Northeast manifestations, and that what we really need is to kind of build a very localized culture history. But we really end up, the Turner Farm essentially became the replacement for Ritchie.
Yeah,
so
yeah, right.
Like, instead of elsewhere in the Northeast, everything references back to Turner Farm.
Yeah, and Ritchie, for the listener who's not in this, is a book about basically it's by Bill Ritchie, and it's the projectile points of New York. It's called something like that, and it's basically it's almost like an antiques guide to projectile points from New York. One, of course, Bill Ritchie was Bruce Pork's mentor from Turner Farm.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Was he a supervisor, or was he just they just worked together?
Mentor, I think, not a supervisor, is my recollection. Okay. But so my understanding is actually that's part of why this is totally talking out of school now, but that Turner Farm maybe dug in feet was he was borrowing Bill Ritchie's equipment. And Bill Ritchie only had, I believe they call it ominously, imperial units on his tape measures.
Huh. Yeah. Well, there you go.
Anyway, yeah. But so like the Transitional Archaic mostly understood in this region from the Turner Farm site, and that's the reason for this. In part is that Turner Farm is well preserved, and so check out Bruce Pork's book, the Silver Hunters. I think we referenced this last week. And but what's unique about it is it has that Maritime Archaic period we talked about last week, and then it's got Susquehanna stuff, which is cool. And it also has, very importantly, shell. And so as shell breaks down, it releases calcium carbonate into the soil. And so what happens is, if you ever tried to like garden in Maine or New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, the soil is super acidic. But as the shell breaks down, it makes the soil more basic. And so you get animal bone preserves, so you can interpret what people were eating. And that's kind of a unique thing about shell-bearing sites, so sites that have soft-shell clam that are breaking down. And so what happened at Turner Farm was it became apparent that rather than this sort of swordfish and cod specialization we talked about, I keep saying last week, but really I mean 4 weeks ago.
It was several weeks ago now, but the last episode or last
normal episode, yeah. Where we talked about maritime archaic people being into swordfish and cod. What actually happens is that in the transitional archaic, 3,800, 4,000 years ago, people are more into the kinds of foods that we're going to talk about in the next fortnight. So they're more into eating soft-shell clam. They're more into bear. They're more into cervids, and that's what archaeologists, when they're feeling very serious, like to call deer-like animals. They're more into birds. They're more into sculpins. They're more into sturgeon, and they're more into cod, right? So what we've got is this kind of, it's a broader kind of pattern of what people are eating, and it much more resembles what people continue to eat for the next, chunk of time between 4,000 years ago and European contact.
Yep.
Does that jive with your understanding, Ken?
Yeah, and some evidence too of like tree nuts as well.
Right.
These are these cobble hearths, I guess. That was that at Boswell or were they at Turner Farm?
My understanding is actually that they're at a number of small and less interesting sites in those. So the one I think of when I think of that is the Waterville-Winslow Bridge.
Okay.
Which shockingly is between Waterville, Maine and Winslow, Maine. Which
just past the Hannafords, right, Gabe?
It is just that's an inside joke that exactly 2 of our listeners have just laughed at, Ken. But the listener will be shocked, as based on my ability to easily describe projectile points, I'm also very good at giving directions. And and it's not the first time Ken was lost based on Cape Rhinic directions, I don't think. But no, it's not just past the Hannafords. It's just past the farmer's market and towards the CVS. But
okay, there you go.
But there's also a fairly good Chinese restaurant near there.
Yeah, it's literally every town in New England.
Yeah, I know. And then you hit the Hannafords. But no, and there Art Speaks and these guys that made the it's not the Maine State Archaeologist technically, but essentially the Maine State Archaeologist, the senior archaeologist, I think, for the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, does all the Department of Transportation archaeology. And so when they were putting this new bridge, found this really interesting kind of cobble hearth. And so it's stones mixed with fire-cracked rock. And they hypothesized that potentially it might be a place where you process tree nuts, so things like acorns. And so this is kind of interesting because it raises this notion, right, where we've talked a lot about a kind of unknowable coastal occupation, right, because of sea level rise. So sea levels are rising and they're knocking out what we could know from the coast. So we've had just these interior sites. Now we're starting to think about the coast and the interior. And that actually pivots to where New Brunswick becomes really important in this whole discussion. So this is the moment where Ken and I realized we've laid out the show notes somewhat awkwardly.
I was just gonna say, I was like, where do we jump to now?
But anyway, so I had this thought. I was like, oh yeah, we should just, in my mind when I was flipping through these earlier, I thought, you know what we should do? We should talk about that fish weir we forgot to talk about 28 days ago. But
the Sebastopol fish weir complex?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk about that?
Well, fairly famous, major, not a Hakuna errata, I guess, because we didn't get anything wrong, but it was an error of omission.
Lacuna errata.
Hey, there you go. We need a new song, actually. And fairly famous fish weir complex that dates mostly to the late Archaic, with possibly as early as a Middle Archaic component to it. Is that, if I remember correctly?
My understanding, yeah.
And essentially, it was identified because one of the dams in the area had basically was doing an annual letdown, and it was sort of a lower than normal letdown for some kind of repair. And so for the listener, you might be familiar with when you put in a hydroelectric dam that creates a head pond. For archaeology, that also creates basically a massive lake over what were probably occupied spaces for thousands of years. So, case in point, like the Matquack Dam in New Brunswick, something like over 100 kilometers of head pond above the Matquack Dam, sort of submerged a fairly substantial Wolastoqiyik and Wabanaki landscape, basically, that we actually have very little information about before the dam went in. So when these drawdowns happen, they're actually very important. You can recover a lot of information from them. Jim Petersen and some other folks from the University of Maine, is that correct?
Yeah, University of Maine at Farmington.
At Farmington, yeah. And where they used to have the UMF ARC program that Gabe and his partner actually, you guys met at UMF ARC, did you not?
No, we'd met before, but the romantic interlude began there. Yeah,
began screening through something.
Well, I mean, it was fantastic. I mean, you never know how to meet someone until you've they wet screened all their features, right? And they did 100% flotation. So you have a fair bit of time to get to know someone at that in such a situation. Yeah.
So the drawdown happens, and they go and do some survey work, and they identify all of these what look like basically sticks poking out of the mud, and these are actually stakes of a fairly large and long occupied weir complex. And so a weir is basically a structure that you put usually at the mouth of a river. And it's there's a couple of different ways you can design this. Is it Roger Lewis did a thesis on this from
Munn, I believe.
Munn? Roger Lewis, who works for the Nova Scotia Museum, is that correct?
He certainly did. I actually don't know if he still does.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's a few different ways that Wabanaki would have built these weirs, but essentially it boils down to you build a structure and you catch fish, anadromous fish, or fish that are basically moving up and down rivers, so that spend half their lives in the ocean and come inside and then run up rivers to lay their eggs and then go back out. So you catch them on these.
It's a funnel.
It's a funnel, yeah.
It looks like a funnel. Yeah.
It's basically a giant net to catch fish. And so they demonstrated they had a number of tools, radiocarbon dates that indicated that the site had been used as early as the Middle Archaic, but heavily throughout the Late Archaic, and then persists into the Transitional Archaic. And I think into the Woodland or not.
Ken, if we prepped for these, we would know this. But I think it does persist. My recollection is, because it is well radiocarbon dated, that it persisted into the Woodland.
And so it ties in with this whole thing that we talked about a few weeks ago about, sort of complex behaviors among hunter-gatherers at this time. This would have been a fairly organized group effort to go out there and build this weir structure and certainly maintain it, and what it looks like based on the distribution of these posts throughout the area around the mouth of this river, that, the groups were moving. It was moving around and being kind of rejigged all the time. And so probably indicates that groups are coming back there like every year or seasonally, and being reused over millennia, basically. And so that persists into the Transitional Archaic. And what we know from other sites, like, for example, at Mike Deal and
John Campbell.
Jack Campbell.
John, right?
John. Sorry, Jack
John
Campbell
Andrew.
Jack Campbell is the former goalie of the Toronto Maple Leafs. That's why I'm getting screwed up here. Yeah. I think I said fantastic. Jack Campbell earlier too.
Oh, whoops. We're sorry, John.
Let's just wind that back here.
No, let's just leave it. We might as well let the listener know what sort of pain we go through as we. What the listener can't see is that I'm surrounded by 10,000 baseball cards right now. So it's been a bit of a sports merchandise kind of afternoon.
Leafs won tonight. That's the last game of the regular season.
So
Mike Deal and John Campbell have written about this coastal interior seasonal round, where groups maybe are spending summer on the coast, and then are maybe processing anadromous fish on the interior. And this ties in with this notion that maybe the Sebasticook fish weir represents sort of this continuation that kind of coincides with what we're seeing in Nova Scotia, and that this same kind of practice is going on in the interior in Maine.
Which so we're starting to think. Did I ever tell you? Sorry, I'm just totally interrupting myself here. But I held one of those fish weir stakes.
That's incredible. Like, I mean, what's incredible what the listener doesn't realize is you should really read this article, which we'll put in the show notes.
Yeah.
They recovered, because this is a drowned site. So this is a site that's generally underwater. When sites are preserved underwater, you usually end up having what are called anoxic conditions. And so think about the bog bodies in the old world, where you have basically things are submerged, oxygen can't get in and deteriorate organic perishables. And so they not only had all these stakes preserved that showed very clear indications that like groundstone axes were being used to cut these things to shape, sort of to make them pointy, which I'm guessing this is sort of one of the ones that you may have seen.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
But they also recovered like incredible textiles. Like there's a fragment of a birch bark basket that's been recovered from there.
Yeah, and this was my understanding. This is part of Petersen's research, was in textiles, baskets, this kind of thing. But no, it was incredibly cool. It was my understanding is half of them went somewhere for preservation, and half of them stayed at the Maine State Museum for preservation. And but one of the Maine State Museum ones I got to hold and felt very cool, I have to say.
That was very cool.
There's a great picture. My parents, actually, when this was discovered, Jim Petersen holding one of the stakes was in color on a front page of a section of the Bangor Daily News.
Oh, no way.
And my parents had just this file labeled Maine, and at one point it was home, and they showed me it. It was kind of cool. Neat picture. I'll send you a scan at some point. It was pretty cool. But part of what we're thinking about then, though, is how these folks are starting to really exploit both coast and interior. And so when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about watercraft. And so this is going to be continuing just on the listener can't see this, but Ken and I will persistently just shrug and say, I don't know what happened, and it's a weird time period.
Yeah, and we've talked about a little bit about how technology was interpreted as like maybe indicating groundstone tools in the early Archaic, right?
Because of
groundstone tools,
canoes, yeah.
Dugout canoes, yeah, sorry. Groundstone tools were indicating some dugout canoe technology. What we see in the transitional Archaic,
Ken is maybe 2/3 into a Courvoisier, the listener, isn't
it? Is sort of a re-emphasis on flakestone technology, which and a number of tools so these drills that we talked about already, scraping tools, and particular types of kind of knives and bifaces and things like that, tools that we think might be particularly well suited toward the production of, and I don't know if this is a direct quote, but this is in my notes for a lecture, a shift toward lightweight, portable, and swift-moving birch bark vessel technology. And that may be a quote from your book.
It doesn't ring a bell, but that doesn't mean... So I have to say, Ken, when I wrote the chapter, Susquehanna and Early Woodland, I was in a very dark place because I didn't know what I was talking about.
So, but one of the things that Matt Betts and Gabe point out in their book, though, is that well, there are indications both in the changes in environment that seem to indicate that birch bark would be readily available at this time, and changes in technology, which might kind of lend toward the development of sort of this new vessel technology that would cast you up and down rivers or that you'd be able to convey yourself up and down rivers very quickly. So which would facilitate this sort of seasonal round. While these things are all in place, the likelihood that birch bark canoes just sort of completely replaced dugout canoes is pretty far-fetched. This wasn't sort of a wholesale replacement. There's even evidence, in the post-contact, for example, that even though birch bark vessel technology had been perfected in the subsequent thousands of years, Wabanaki groups were even using hide to make canoes in some cases. So
right, those are the bull boats.
The bull boats, yeah.
Yeah.
So
and then Tim Spar and colleagues found a dugout canoe from the late woodlands on Cape Porpoise, Maine, somewhat near the Bush compound. That's the former president, two former presidents. For Canadian listeners, that's just like a prime minister.
Well, it's really not, though.
No, I know it's not at all.
It's what Pierre Poilievre envisions being a prime minister.
It's a prime minister with a god complex.
Yeah.
But but we kind of pull this in. Okay, so we've got this kind of anthropological question that Ken and I have been hinting around, and that is, what is the transitional archaic, right? What is this Susquehanna thing? And a lot of the discussion around this has really hovered around this idea that Susquehanna, that the transitional archaic are this kind of migration into the far northeast or the northeast. And this has a lot to do with a guy named Irving Rouse, who my understanding is his friends called him Ben Rouse. That's do you know how to know someone went to Yale, Ken? It's to find out that instead of Irving gets turned into Ben. That's
a Yaley thing.
Yeah, we've got a loose association between your nickname and your actual name. Okay. The listener doesn't know this, but Ken's real name is it's not Kenneth, let me tell you. But that it would be there should be an identifiable migrating population. You should know where that population came from, right? They should have a sort of real, like, definable homeland. And you would want, I love this phrase, I think this might be a directive from Rouse, a contemporaneity of manifestations of a migration event, which just means that you would want it to look as if there was a migration. You would want there to be a bunch of things repeatedly appearing along the route that people migrated. So you'd want these broad spears to appear repeatedly where they were supposed to appear. You don't want the other stuff to appear,
and rapidly, exactly. Either at the same time or very rapidly, like
precisely.
Basically.
Yeah. And then you'd want environmental and cultural conditions that were conducive to migration. So, like when we were talking about Clovis, I mean, you've got this, you wouldn't, but a lot of the Clovis discussion just hinges on, was there an ice-free corridor, right? Where were people going that had a reasonable place to go? And this is one of Rouse's explanations, I think is interesting, which is that other explanations need to be ruled out, right? Migration is not shouldn't be your default interpretation for understanding prehistory, because it's kind of a niche thing, right? Like, it's not all that common. And then David Sanger added to this discussion that it should be a whole culture, not just a mortuary subsystem, for instance. So what I think Dave Sanger is saying in that is that a population migration should seem like a group of people moved here with all the things that a group of people do, not just one fad, basically.
Yeah, because changes in burial custom could be caused by a group responding to changes in the environment more broadly. Like burial custom may change even though the group ethnically has not changed. Basically, like there isn't a new genetic population or a new cultural population basically there, that they've just changed a way of doing things.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you're a skeptic about, so we should distinguish between migration and population replacement, right? Which I think has been, so many archaeologists, I think, this is sort of weird. You sort of feel like you're doing this podcast and you're like, at the bar, you're comfortable to say something, and you're like, oh, it's going to get recorded and someone's going to listen or email in if you disagree with this. But my understanding is, sorry, that perhaps was too passive. I'm fully aware that many archaeologists have interpreted Susquehanna as a population replacement. So this idea that people showed up in the region and they replaced the people who were there before. So they replaced the people who are from the Maritime Archaic.
Yeah.
And there's full disclosure, if you want an opinion that differs certainly from mine, check out Bruce Bork's work, Swordfish Hunters, his book about Turner Farm, published by Plenum Press in 1995. Any of those things will have the alternative view to this. And I think Ken and I actually may be at probably a sort of 40-60 minority position on this about population replacement. Are we still in the minority?
I don't know. I mean, I think so. I would definitely lean towards this being in the realm of what you could convincingly call a migration.
Me too.
I think that much like the sort of Atlantic, it really looks like this is a fairly rapid and very different thing that's going on. So there's clearly I think there's something, it's so new and is so different than what was happening before. I think it'd be very hard to argue that this was not a new group of people, right? Or that even if it wasn't a new group of people, the people that were there were being so influenced by somebody else that they rapidly changed. And so, whether or not, like, I think it's visibly a migration, but because the change is so rapid and because what was there before stops happening, the influence was enough that local people were changing what they were doing. And I don't think there's for me, I'm not convinced that this was a population replacement. I think without question, this was a dramatic moment or moments where groups were probably interacting and trying to negotiate and figure out who gets to stay where. And I think archaeologically, sometimes these things can end up looking like replacements, because what ends up happening is that one group maybe comes into a region, and whether it's that, groups intermarry, one maybe it becomes the predominant expression of a cultural manifestation. But whether or not you can say that those are people being chased entirely out, and being, that the Maritime Archaic people disappeared, I think is a pretty hard argument to make. In part because you can see cultural continuities in a bunch of other things that suggest that whether or not we see Maritime Archaic persisting beyond what it looked like in the late Maritime Archaic, you see stuff going on in later periods that looks very similar to what people were doing, prior to the Susquehanna episode.
And also that one imagines that Rouse's criteria for an in-migration would be the same for an out-migration, right? That we should be able to. Yeah.
You should see you should see these Maritime Archaic people, instead of disappearing from, New Brunswick all the way up to Labrador.
Yeah, right.
You should see them go somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Like
and Jim Petersen actually talked about this. And so this is a great article, actually. We'll put it in the show notes, but it's a 1995 article. This doesn't get cited as much as it should, I don't think. And so what Petersen's doing, it's called like Preceramic, what is it called?
Archaeological manifestations, isn't that what it is?
That's the one, yeah. Preceramic archaeological manifestations in the far northeast. That's a good phrase, far northeast.
Yep.
And
it's one of the first published references of far northeast, isn't it?
I think it is. And so listener, I know it's on your bookshelf, or perhaps on your bedside table even.
Perhaps even on your desk.
It might even be on your desk. It might even be the thing that's holding your monitor up. It's thick enough. But Ken and I did a book on basically the Woodland period in the far northeast, which we take to mean basically like Biddeford, Maine up.
Yeah. But could include Vermont and places like that.
Right. Yeah. Anyway, Petersen said, quote, as some might expect, evidence of continuity between the Susquehanna and earlier Preceramic. So he means, by Preceramic, he basically means before 3,000 years ago. Entities is beginning to emerge in the region. For example, redundancy in site location, including both habitations and cemeteries, perhaps some aspects of the supposedly different burial practices, e.g. cremations, red ochre, etc. Raw material usage, trade patterns, and even some aspects of technology, for example, stemp biface forms, some groundstone celts, axes and gouges, etc., all picture counter to the conventional argument. And by conventional argument, he means that population replacement argument we were talking about. And he says, moreover, the same authors who argue for a decreased marine resource competency during Susquehanna times have noted changing environmental conditions at the end of the Moorhead tradition after 4000 to 3800 BP, which brought increasingly colder water into the Gulf of Maine. This may account for the decreased emphasis on swordfish, for example, during the Susquehanna tradition, rather than being a different adaptation per se. And I think that's actually a really crucial. I really like that paragraph from Petersen. I think it's sort of prescient in some interesting ways. And but I think one just key argument he makes, and I think this is really one that Matt made, Matt Betts at various points, which is that you want to be careful about interpreting people's adaptations to a changing environment as being this big cultural discontinuity, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you're not going to be adapted to hunt swordfish if you don't have swordfish near where you are.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, at the same time, too, so you get the Gulf of Maine water changing, but in the interior, you have really kind of a stabilization of a lot of river systems at around 3,800, between 3,800 and about 3,000 years ago is when the present day configuration of a lot of these river systems that drain into the Gulf of Maine, when they became established as they are today. So the present day shorelines and things like that. That's sort of these environments settled out at this time, and so what you're seeing is kind of an explosion of sort of this broad spectrum behavior. Maybe the fact that a period of fairly dynamic climatic change that had been going on for several thousand years sort of levels out, and things kind of normalize to a certain degree, right?
Totally, yeah. And so along with that kind of question, though, that you raised about this sort of environmental changes is this question about regional distribution that we've talked about, right? So, it's kind of interesting. I think one of the things that when we talk about regional prehistory is this idea of the Northeast, and we've parsed it out further into the far Northeast, which is just like the Northeast, but you don't grow corn.
Yeah.
It's just that questions of regional distribution. And this is one of the ones that really hovered around the questions of Susquehanna and migration. So for a long time, there's this question, did Susquehanna make it to the Maritimes? Like, really? And this was, discussed, I think Dave Black and Dave Sanger talked about this in the CJA, the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, extensively. And so did this kind of broad spirit tradition make it up this far? And so I think maybe, Ken, the kind of useful thing for us to talk about, I think the answer is yes. Would be my view. Is that your view as well?
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that maybe the way to do this, I was at a conference once, and a cultural anthropologist I admire a whole lot, this guy named Jim Roscoe, one of my professors, actually. He didn't really want to make an argument about something he was talking about, so instead he said, I'm just going to sort of prove this by citation. And he had a slide and had a list of 60 or 70 people who had argued something. And he felt that was conclusive. So what we're going to essentially do, I think, here is we're going to make an argument by citation that Susquehanna.
do the rundown.
Yeah, so we'll do the rundown here. And Ken knows more about many of these than I do. I feel a little weird that we're leading with Dave Black here, but but Dave, I think, has done some incredible work on this, and I think it's worth mentioning Dave's work on this because it touches on some of the things we've talked about just on this podcast, that you should have, if you're a professional archaeologist, good relationship with responsible collectors.
Yep.
And so out of Dave's work, in large part with responsible collectors, also out of his field research, he sort of recognized that there are, in fact, a fair bit of transitional archaic materials in the Passamaquoddy Bay region. And it turns out, for reasons that are unknown, these sites face northwest. And for the listener who is listening to our episodes backwards, we're talking into the future. This is 3 years later. You're listening in reverse. You already listened to our woodland episodes. You'll know that our coastal sites tend to be, south-ishly oriented. And so you've got these northwest-oriented sites. And on top of that, they're intertidal sites. So they're on the beach. And these are at places like Rum Beach, which is a cool site. We should get Dave on to talk about Rum Beach. That's a cool site.
It would be a cool site. Good discussion and a great monograph to go with it. Yeah,
it would. Yeah. If you're listening, Dave, we'll be in touch tomorrow. People will call you people. And but where there's these affinities with Susquehanna, and like Dave, has pointed out, basically, that there was this paper in Archaeology of North America from Massachusetts by the late Brian Jones and Brianna Ray, about a similar kind of intertidal northwest facing Susquehanna site. If you sort of plop that site in the Quoddy region, nobody would blink at it. It looks very similar to stuff Dave's talking about from the Rum Beach site. And then Ken correctly pointed out, as I was lounging on the couch earlier and not thinking about this podcast, that Harper, in fact, had found some Susquehanna stuff at Portland Point, right?
Yeah. So the Occupation 3. So the Portland Point is a site that it was originally excavated, I think, because it was a French fort. Is that like Fort
right.
Latour?
Yeah.
And we talked about it, I think, a little bit because there is a Moorhead burial at that site. This is at the mouth of the St. John River, in the city of St. John, present day city of St. John. In Occupation 3, so there's a fairly clearly a broad sphere, what looks to be sort of this Orient fishtail, so a late Susquehanna style point. There's a steatite vessel fragments, which is interesting. Maybe a drill, like something that looks kind of has this diamond shaped thing, like what you expect to see on these flakestone drills. And so that was in 1958. In 1976, Dave Burley had done some work at the Bentley Street site, which is also in Maine. This is possibly a portage,
also in St. John.
City of St. John. What did I say?
Yeah. You said Maine, yeah.
Oh, City of St. John.
See, Turner Farm has this magnetic pole, even that, everybody...
Yeah.
I feel like I think it was Kevin Leonard who pointed out that the Canadian archaeology textbooks used, or was it American archaeology textbooks used to put sites from the Maritimes in New York? Was it?
But this is like the ongoing theme of like, the Maritimes just being omitted from all maps of the Northeast.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just a sea monster here usually.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the Bentley Street site in City of St. John.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt again though, but Ken is from Fredericton, and if you're from Fredericton, St. John does actually not exist. This is true.
Well, or it's nefarious. That's,
right. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there be dragons. So
well, they're smoking something.
Possibly a portage. Steatite fragments were recovered there. There's all these 19th century accounts of these sort of double grooved axes, which are fairly characteristic of the Susquehanna period in around the Grand Lake Meadows region. So in the period, the sort of group of lakes sort of in the lower Wolastoq, in around Grand Lake and French Lake and those. A fairly famous picture you could probably find online of a steatite vessel that came from the Oromocto Lake region, which may have been ritually killed. So it has this hole in the bottom of it that was possibly perforated by a drill or something else, in an act of maybe sort of intentionally killing or ending the life of that particular vessel, probably for use in a burial context, but unclear if it was or not.
As that's probably a riff on this idea that like Wabanaki nouns can be active or not active, is my understanding, right? And so you can have things that can hold things, like vessels are active nouns, and other things are inactive nouns. And so the and Ken and I should not take a foray into Wabanaki linguistics right now, but there's this sort of idea that there are different kinds of nouns that may not be familiar to us in kind of a Western canon, but so that things that are kind of alive, like vessels, it would make sense that you think about them differently than you do about these inactive nouns.
Yeah, and so we would perceive usually one of these steatite vessels as an inanimate object, but these are not necessarily inanimate objects to the people who made them.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's also possibly another complete steatite vessel that was found in French Lake, which is in the Grand Lake region again. It may be the same one that Campbell's talking about, and but so there's basically a recovery of a bunch of different sort of characteristic artifacts. So Susan Blair in her the Wolastoqig Gemseg report talks about how sort of if you aggregate the number of steatite vessels recovered in the lower Wolastoq alone, it actually totals more than what has been found in sites in Maine, at least up to that point when she wrote that.
Super interesting.
Book, which is really interesting. And so, and John Campbell in his master's thesis actually has a great table where he kind of outlines the number of artifacts that appear to be Susquehanna-like from New Brunswick, totaling about 55. And this includes, these are axes, steatite vessels, and a whole variety of sort of the whole suite of Susquehanna style projectile points. But what I think is most interesting about Campbell's thesis is that he has these maps where he kind of plots out where all this transitional archaic stuff is, and you can draw kind of a straight line from kind of, I don't know, around Bangor area across to Fredericton, and then out to the north shore of Prince Edward Island, probably in around like Brackley Beach area. And there's nothing north of that other than one site in Quebec, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and I would love if I could directly quote this, but the effect of I think the implicate that it's at the end of this chapter in the bookman I did, we say something like, huh. I think that's this is interesting. We I certainly don't know what to make of it.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that so we say that the line cuts off somewhere around Fredericton, and there's this interesting sort of transitional archaic component at the Gemseg site in the lower Wolastoq that has some affinities to looks like what there's stuff in there, and the dates kind of are from about 3300 to about 2900, so right in that Orient phase, kind of that
years ago.
Years ago. That sort of late transitional archaic Orient phase. There's some Orient style points that were probably found in the disturbed area of the site, but there's also some other objects that were recovered at Gemseg that are very similar to these dates from these features in Miramichi, which have these sort of oversized bifaces. The Quarryville site, which is a burial site, and a similar one, and the Boulder campsite, which is a small campsite. And these date to between 2800 and about 2900 years ago, sort of toward the end of the transitional archaic and the sort of onset of what we would conventionally call the early woodland. And what's clear is that there's this sort of mashup going on that we don't have enough radiocarbon dates. We don't have good enough contexts to be able to parse out where the Orient phase becomes the early woodland, right? And I think this is really what Petersen's kind of driving at, is that, we have these sort of this persistence in places where people are occupying for several millennia. And while you have this dramatic shift from these late maritime archaic, burial patterns, this Moorhead thing kind of ends. It's not like people leave places, and it's not like they even choose to live in different places, right?
That's right. Yeah, and so we should say, I just want to kind of catch the listener up. So Gemseg is fairly close to Fredericton, but for the listener from outside of New Brunswick,
I thought we had talked about. I suppose we've talked about Gemseg in an earlier episode.
It's possible the listener doesn't listen to these with a religious fervor that we.
That is true. So
yeah.
So the Gemseg Crossing archaeological site, BKDM 14 in the Borden classification system.
Ken just checked his tattoo on his forearm for the listener that can't see that. Yeah.
So it was a site that was excavated as a result of the twinning of the Trans-Canada Highway. For those in New Brunswick, big project even in my youth, in the early 90s, excavated sort of as a collaborative project between researchers, the provincial government, Indigenous groups, and the Department of Transportation, as well as some private consultants that were brought on for the work. And Susan Blair, who is professor at University of New Brunswick, she was one of the project directors during the field work, and also wrote up, along with Karen Purley, who was the former head of the Maliseet Advisory Committee on Archaeology, a provincial government entity. They wrote up the results of the archaeological work at Gemseg in a couple of published volumes that actually you'll be able to find in the show notes in PDF form online. Some really great archaeological work and publications, and 2-volume publication, basically, that the first of which is actually consists of a lot of stories told by Wolastoqwig themselves about places in and around Gemseg in the lower Wolastoq where they were living, in their memories of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and then grafted over this second volume, which is the archaeological results, showing this sort of deep occupation and connection to place at Gemseg, basically.
And we should just say, like, in case we forget to mention it again, because we'll probably talk about Gemseg again, but it's sort of a pioneering collaborative archaeology project.
Yep.
Incredibly influential. I mean, it's probably the most important collaborative archaeology project in New Brunswick. Tone setting.
Yeah, and at a time where not many people were doing real collaborative archaeology. Like this was
right.
This was a co-managed project between Indigenous groups, community members, and archaeologists and non-Indigenous archaeologists, and had a real push for education and capacity building within communities, and was and actually was probably kind of a watershed moment for archaeology in New Brunswick, in the sense that it started to build back trust between archaeologists and Indigenous groups that had been lost as a result of a number of sort of controversial things that had happened in the 80s and early 90s. So
yeah, so highly recommend that folks check this out. Okay, so to kind of return to, we've been talking about jump sag. Another site we should mention is Boswell, and because this is in Nova Scotia, and this is recently
on the
published,
North Shore of Nova Scotia.
Absolutely, yeah. Which we don't really have a good breakdown of where all of our listeners are from, because we know you're using VPNs anyway. It all seems like you're coming in from, Iraqi Kurdistan. What are the odds that we should have 6 listeners from Iraqi Kurdistan? I don't know. But this is recently published in Canadian Journal of Archaeology. But also this, are we still calling him Jack Campbell, or should we call him John Andrew Campbell? So John Andrew Campbell did his master's thesis on this, but Mike Deals had a long-term research project here. And but what's sort of interesting about this site from Nova Scotia is that it may have material that represents the whole, we talked about that Atlantic all the way to Orient phase temporal sequence for the Transitional Archaic. It seems like Boswell has all of that. And then on top of that, it's got Maritime Woodland, which we're going to talk about in a fortnight. And then below that, it may have some late Maritime Archaic. So this is, if there were a site that, you imagine Jim Petersen, this site is a bass drum. Jim Petersen's got the hammer strolling out. It's like, it's like the old King Kong movie, right, where they hit the big, yeah, exactly, and then King Kong appears. And so this site is a bit like that, where the site smells a bit more like continuity than many of these other sites have. And that's super interesting. So, but as Ken pointed out, past this, we don't know. We're not sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's almost a good place to transition to something else.
It is. Should we leave them with this Robinson quote, if that's so beautifully vague as to just inspire a sort of Zen-like appreciation of this period that we don't understand?
I think so.
Is that Brian Robinson, the sadly late Brian Robinson, 2001, he said that the Transitional Archaic implicates major mechanisms of social change at the transition between the Archaic and the Woodland, then in quotes, stages, end quote, almost regardless of the side one takes in the Susquehanna migration argument. So that's right, listener. Major mechanisms of social change. That's where Ken and I are going to leave you as we transition over to our hit pieces for this fortnight. So Ken, do you mind if I lead with our hit pieces this week?
You can.
Fantastic. So the Provincial Archaeology Office out of Newfoundland and Labrador, they endeavor every year to release this really useful publication, which is essentially a review, as the title would imply, of the archaeology that's been done in the province in the previous year. So what they basically do is they sort of have, my understanding is it's people who've held permits in the province in the previous year, right? Archaeology projects permits are encouraged to submit a kind of suitable for professional or educated avocational consumption report of what they did. And this is fantastic. And it produces a great review of the previous year's work. And oftentimes the chapters or the, I suppose, articles within it are eminently citable. And I think we should just applaud this, because they are the Atlantic Canadian province that does this, right? Where you at least have a sense of, in the previous year, what your tax dollars, because, dear listener, you are paying your tax dollars to do archaeology in the region that you live in. Perhaps maybe you're paying tax dollars to do archaeology in other regions. I don't really know how you're. I don't want to get you indicted, but however you're working it. If you live in New Hampshire, you're not paying tax dollars for anything. As I sit here comfortably, but the PAO is putting the public scholars to work, and so you can just download these, and we'll put a link to these in the show notes. But if you just want to Google it, it's the PAO review, and it's volume 21, and that's the 2022 review of all archaeological research done in Newfoundland and Labrador last year. And then Ken has some information about an upcoming thing he's involved in at the CA.
Yeah, and just on the PAO, just before we leave that, I think what the listeners should also realize is that these have also grown as opposed to contracting. So these are getting bigger and broader in their coverage each year. It's up to 327 pages this year, which is these started out as sort of 20 to 25 page reviews with a few articles in them. They do a great job. They have a big map at the start that shows you where all this field work took place. So you get a sense of the scope of kind of the research enterprise and maybe the CRM, what's going on there. And it really is a shame that we don't have this coming from the Maritime provinces. And so if you are interested in archaeology, one of the things you should push for as members of the public is to, write to your MLA and say that we would really love to see something akin to the PAO come out of provincial government offices in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and PEI, because it's going to be a benefit to you. Maybe we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the Transitional Archaic if we had a little bit more to write on. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ken. And the PAO version of this is it's unique in Lake Canada. It's not exactly unique in the region. We should say that there are pretty much every state in New England has a bulletin, which serves sort of the same function that the PAO thing does, right? Where it's
exactly
these are the hits, So for the PAO is free, in the same way that for a very modest fee you can access the ones in New England.
As somebody who failed spectacularly at trying to create a New Brunswick archaeology journal, I can say that it is. You're doing the Lord's work if you take this on. So
yeah, and in fact, Ken, I almost feel like we should provide a form letter for people who are like, hey, that might maybe a T-shirt. We could do a form letter with a T-shirt with the form letter on it instead of stickers next time.
Yeah.
But
I demand.
Yeah, because Ken and I can't get reports from this part of the world either. So if you want to write in, let us know. But Ken's doing an exciting session at the CAAs this year.
Yeah, so I'm the chair of the advocacy committee at the Canadian Archaeological Association, and
which is why he just leaned into telling you something that he'd like you to advocate for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, along with my colleagues Marissa Barris, Stephen Dorland, and Beatrice Fletcher, we are co-hosting.
Can you give their affiliations too? I'm sorry.
Marissa Barris is the interim director of the Canadian version of ICOMOS. I may have misquoted. She's an interim director of ICOMOS in some capacity. Stephen Dorland is an assistant professor at Grand Valley State University. And Beatrice Fletcher is a PhD candidate at McMaster University. She's also a sessional instructor there, teaches separate courses. And so we are co-hosting an online and in-person session called Professional Careers in Archaeology and Beyond. And this is basically going to be a panel discussion with a number of professional archaeologists from across Canada, representing both heritage disciplines, CRM, as well as Indigenous consultants and groups that represent Indigenous community members and heritage more generally. And so basically it's an opportunity aimed at senior undergraduate or graduate students, or really anybody in their undergraduate who's interested in what can you do with a career in archaeology or a degree in archaeology, and what are the pathways maybe that these people took to getting their degrees. So we've got a gentleman who is the head of a small historical society in St. Catharines, Ontario. We've got the director of, or the former director of Newfoundland Heritage, basically. We also have an Indigenous elder and consultant, and some folks that have worked in the CRM industry, business owners, that kind of thing. And so basically the session will be these panelists will kind of do a short presentation about their careers, the kind of education they had, their pathways, and then it's going to be opened up into a discussion where we'll kind of moderate with questions from the online participants as well as in person, and just encourage everybody to attend and kind of take an opportunity. I was lucky enough to go to a very big school for my PhD, so I went to U of T, where these professionalization events were organized by the department that I was in, but a lot of smaller institutions don't actually have that opportunity. And so the idea is that we're trying to level the playing field here for people who are either actively in education, learning about archaeology or doing a degree in archaeology, and those who might be interested in it, and how can this pan out? Like, how do you end up becoming a professional, and what kind of careers could you look at?
That's great. And we know that I think we've talked about this before, that there's going to be something like in the United States, and we assume this will be somewhat mirrored in Canada. The United States looking at like 8,000 too few archaeologists in the next decade.
Yeah. And I had kind of a shocking conversation with a gentleman who used to work with the National Parks Service in the States, who said that it's not just an issue of you don't have enough archaeologists to do the work. You don't have enough archaeologists who can review the work. So it's like there's these sort of industry-wide challenges, and so it's not just archaeologists, but there's a lot of people too in the heritage sector who are getting close to retirement age and that kind of thing. And so I think there's actually a really great opportunity for a lot of students who are coming up through in the anthropology and archaeology world to look forward to brighter futures and employment opportunities in a variety of different fields. So
yeah, absolutely, which is fantastic. Ken and I are sitting, of course, we're sitting here talking to you about this from our what everyone imagines an archaeologist does. So yeah, we teach, but I'm Indiana Jones. Ken teaches. I'm in a fedora actually somewhere, in the American Southwest. But Ken is leaving his, lame-o life in Lethbridge, Alberta as a professor. But the student should know that in addition to my life, involving Nazis, Russian with their swords, and so forth, that this can really be a good career if you're interested in archaeology. And then we should plug just quickly, if you're at the SAAs,
CAs.
The CAAs. If you're at the SAAs, you've already missed us, but you've seen Ken. If you're at the CAAs, you should find us. We're hoping to have another batch of stickers. We'll be doing also the David W. Black Papers in Honor of session, who have you heard about? And we're looking forward to that. Lots of good papers. I think we're up to 13 papers in that. Like that.
I think so. And and you'll see us, because we'll have Gabe will be walking around with one of those big like sort of a goofy, like a very large chain, and the microphone hanging off of it, so we can just kind of grab you in the hallway and go.
Yeah, usually I'm the Indiana Jones of Canadian archaeology, but at the CAAs I'm the Flavor Flav of Canadian archaeology. Yeah. The show is, I think, Flavors of Love, which is not what we've called the David W. Black session, but we thought about it. Well, Ken, I'm looking at a half-finished bottle of Courvoisier. How about you?
I am too, and before we go, I do want to mention this is actually the second episode in a row that King Kong has come up. And
is it really?
Yeah. Patrick Jolicoeur brought up King Kong in reference to Skull Island.
Oh, so he did. Yeah. Is that just a non sequitur? You're just mentioning
just total non sequitur. I just wanted to get that in before we stopped recording.
Well,
thank you, listener.
We'll be in gorilla suits. But we will. We'll see you in a fortnight, and we appreciate you tuning in. And we would really like to thank you all. It means a lot to have had over 1,000 listens. The next one that we'll be very excited about is 10,000. So listen up, and we will see you in a fortnight, or talk to you in a fortnight.
Talk to you soon, listener.
Take care. We stuck the landing on that, but
Going closer.
Yeah, I think we'll need to lean in. Okay. All right. So I'm just going to let this run. I can do all. Welcome to the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast, coming to you live from the Chili's at the Calgary Airport. And I'm joined today with Gabe Yanicki, fellow archaeologist and fellow freezing fog stayed archaeologist. Gabe, what brings you to the Calgary Airport Chili's?
I'm just wrapping up field work here in southern Alberta and trying to get home. If anyone ever tells you they're doing field work in southern Alberta in March, you can take it on my authority that they are a very silly person.
And so field work at the end of March. What sort of field work would that be for?
I just spent the better part of 2 weeks digging down at Wally's Beach, which is a fantastic site down by Hardston in southern Alberta. Wally's Beach is best known for its late Pleistocene megafauna trackways, including horse, camel, muskox, and even footprints. Horse, camel, muskox, and even woolly mammoth footprints.
Woolly mammoth.
Woolly mammoth. But also the bones of a lot of those species. And it's also a great site documenting the earliest ancestral First Nations presence in the Ice-Free Corridor region. It's got a cultural record spanning the Clovis era right through to European and the settler history of this region in the late 1800s. But the bones, meanwhile, show evidence of human butchery. We've got broken camel ribs that have been smashed off at stone tools, cut marks on camel rib and a horse hide bone. And the bones date back to about 15,350 years before present. So getting into a window of 200 years pre-Clovis. Most exciting. So
Very cool. And I'm guessing that wrapping up the fieldwork this time of year, that the results weren't quite what you expected.
not quite what I was hoping for. We were expecting some adverse weather, frozen ground, but yeah, we've had some snow over the past few weeks, and that on top of it's been beginning to dry out, but it just turned the surface of the site very slight. So
At least
really tough conditions.
At least you didn't get blasted by the wind too bad. That was
The site is famous for its dust storms. Have you ever been out there?
I have, yeah.
Did you get caught in the wind?
We didn't get caught in the wind, but I was warned by the students that I didn't have anything to cover my face up with it, and that was maybe a bad idea. So
Yeah, you want goggles, you want something for your money.
yeah,
I flew a drone out there a couple of years ago. And the drone's rated to fly in winds up to like 35 kilometers an hour. But by the time the wind gets up to about 20 kilometers at Wally's Beach, the dust clouds are about 10 degrees. It's just complete sandstorm conditions. Yeah, you really have to follow the staked rebar routes that are plotted out of the site. Basically,
wow,
from the dust.
that's a challenge that not many people are used to.
Not in southern Alberta.
And so there. Well, thank you very much, Gabe. I think we're going to return to our Caesars here, and I'll let you get back to Ottawa. And at some point today, I will end up in Portland. Thank you.